Hello. Okay, so the first thing that you are going to need, make sure you have before you get started with this, you have a piece of paper and something to write with. Because as we go through the story, you're actually going to be reporting on the chart that you're going to create. We're going to do 1, 2, 3 rows today, which means you are going to fold your paper in half like this once, fold it in half like this again, and then when you open it up, you actually have 4 rows. 3 of them we're going to complete today. So pencil, paper, folded twice so you have 4 rows. Once you have that done, you'll be able to get started with the activities that will come up as we go through the text of the story. Now, before we start listening, you follow along with the text. I want you to know a few things. The story title is called The Monkey's Paw, and it's split up into 3 parts. Today, we're just going to do part 1, and we're going to stop 3 times, like you already heard, and record on our chart. One of the things I want you to know about the story before we start is it opens with a family. Those are the main characters. There are 3 of them. There's a father and son, and they are at the beginning kind of in their family room. It's at night. There's a fire going, and they are playing chess. So that's one of the things you'll hear that you might not be familiar with. You'll hear some maybe chess terms, and they're kind of thinking about their strategy. So if there's something related to the chess game, those terms might confuse you a little bit, but it's okay. It's not integral for you to understand the story. Just know that that's what game they're playing. Then the mother is there, the wife of Mr. White is there, and she's kind of knitting by the fire, and she's watching, kind of teasing the father about losing the chess match. They're expecting a visitor, although it's getting a little late, it's kind of dark, you'll see that it's raining, and they're thinking maybe he's not going to show up tonight. But the visitor is someone that's important in the story, and he plays a big role in this first part, setting up the story for us. So know that they're expecting someone to come visit, and be very observant of him when he does arrive. Let's see what else. One of the other things that I don't want you to be confused about, it's a word that we don't use, but you'll hear them talk about pounds. And what we know of pounds, we kind of think of that as a unit of measurement, but in some countries, it is actually a unit of money, or previously was a unit of money. So when you hear them talk about 200 pounds, they're not talking about lifting or getting like weights. They are actually referring to money. So remember that. And then finally, there's a good tip. This story is actually in the online version of your textbook, which you are familiar with. It starts on page 105. And I'm telling you that because what you'll notice, and we're actually going to go through that audio in this video, what you'll notice is that there are some vocabulary words throughout the text, and they have these little numbers next to them. You can actually click on them to find out what they are. I'm not going to do that in this video, though. So if you need to at any point look back into the text, it's there for you. You can see it. You can just click on that App Center, go to MyHRW, and you can find the online textbook. And this story starts on page 105. So if you have any desire to go back to the story, or you need to go back to the story, then you can find the text of it there. So here we go with the text of The Monkey's Paw.
The Monkey's Paw, W. W. Jacobs. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlour of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathways are bog, and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter."
Okay, so this is our first stopping point, and in the very top row of your paper, I want you to consider what you see on the screen. What are the descriptions of the setting that make this like a typical scary story or movie? You're going to copy exact text evidence. You're going to get a few bullet points here. What are the things that you've noticed already about the setting? The time, the place, the general atmosphere that you're experiencing with the descriptions of this story. Now, what I have on the next slide, you'll see that I actually have the text here for you. So what I want you to do is pause the video, take a couple minutes, record some bullet points of descriptions that you see here in the text that make you think that this is like maybe a typical scary story or movie that you have seen. What's going on? What time of day is it? What's the atmosphere like? What are the descriptions that make you think the author is setting it up to be a story in the horror genre? So press pause, take a couple minutes to do that, and then we'll move on in the story.
"Mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin grey beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host brought out drinks and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. He began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him." "He don't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White politely. "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man. "Just to look round a bit, you know."
Okay, that's our second stopping point. And what I want you to do is consider this visitor that you have just met, this guy who has just arrived at the White's home. And what you see on the screen here is the question that I want you to the question, and I want you to jot down the answers, but you also see a piece of text there too, so you can kind of reflect back on that. But in the second row here, you're going to make an inference. So second row here, you've already got the first one with your bullet points. Now we're on the second one. On the second one, it says, what inference, and the inference means what's in your brain. What does the text make you think? Based on what the author's telling us, the narrator's telling us, what's something you're thinking? And it says about the visitor, based on what he says and what is said about him. So what are the clues that you have about this guy who's visiting? What you see right here on the screen is the passage where he's most described. So what's he talking about? How's he described as looking? What are the things about him that you notice that make you think something? What is it that you think about him based on the text? So I want you to press pause, take a minute to jot some bullet points down, your thoughts about this visitor based on the text, and then we'll continue in the story. press pause.
"Better where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass, and sighing softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me the other day? About a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Leastways, nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw?" said Mrs. White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips, and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. "To look at," said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket, "it's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the sergeant major, "a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it, so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. "Well, why don't you have 3, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anybody else wished?" persisted the old lady. "The first man had his 3 wishes. Yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw."
Okay, one more stopping point. This is for row 3. So we just really found out kind of a grim detail. But this quote says, "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death." And that was Sergeant Major talking about the last person that had the paw. So the person right before him had 3 wishes that could possibly be granted. He made 2, and then the third one, he wished that he were dead. So based on this quote, what ideas do you have about that person's situation, the last person that had the paw? And that is what you're going to write here in the 3rd row. Jot down some ideas about what you think was going on with this person that would make them make their 3rd wish for death. So press pause, take a couple minutes to record on your 3rd row, and then continue with the story.
So grave that a hush fell upon the group. "If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris," said the old man at last. "What do you keep it for?" The soldier shook his head. "Fancy, I suppose," he said slowly. "I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward." "If you could have another 3 wishes," said the old man, eyeing him keenly, "would you have them?" "I don't know," said the other. "I don't know." He took the paw, and dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire, White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. "Better let it burn," said the soldier solemnly. "Now, if you don't want it, Morris," said the other, "give it to me." "I won't," said his friend doggedly. "I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man." The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. "How do you do it?" he inquired. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud," said the sergeant-major, "but I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like the Arabian Nights," said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the supper. "Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?" Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant-major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. "If you must wish," he said gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket, and placing chairs motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second instalment of the soldier's adventures in India. "If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us," said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train, "we shan't make much out of it." "Did you give him anything for it, father?" inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. "A trifle," said he, colouring slightly. "He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away." "Likely," said Herbert, with pretended horror. "Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with,